I've joined recently for last 2 months, and this is the first time I am in this room after having joined as a senior fellow. And today we are having with us our speaker E. Sridharan. Besides being an eminent scholar here in Delhi, he is a good friend of mine. I know him for several years. He has specifically asked me not to introduce him in so many superlatives, but I must say that he needs some introduction in the sense that he is one of the academics in Delhi who combine equally efficiently his knowledge about Indian politics as well as about India's foreign relations and international relations in general. He is heading the institute which is run here in Delhi by Pennsylvania University, from where he did his PhD. And he has a long list of publications, books, scholarly articles in professional journals, besides also newspaper articles. The subject that he has chosen for today's talk is, I was quite intrigued to read it and also look forward to listen to him. It is India in the Emerging World Order, Rising Power or Constrained Power. Many of us have such questions in our minds. Certainly India has become a very talked about country in the world. Recently I was a visiting professor in New Zealand, and I found the course that I had offered, more or less like this, attracted unusual number of students, undergrad students, which I was myself surprised to see the long list. I could imagine that we Indians may not be so much impressed by India, seeing whatever is happening around every day. But outside India, people are quite impressed by India's growth story. And I wish not many people visit India. Let this myth continue. Having said that, I request Sridharan to make his presentation. Just one second. Anybody having any knowledge about the format? How many? What is it? Speaker. Okay. Sridharan, try to remain within 45 minutes. Okay.
Thank you, Partho. What I'll talk about is India as a rising / emerging power, what kind of power it is, and what kind of power it's likely to become in the foreseeable future, next couple of decades. In the light of the literature on international relations, as Partho just said, in the last 8 to 10 years, there's been a lot of talk about India as a rising power, emerging power, and more extravagantly and perhaps recklessly as a superpower by some people before the economic slowdown of 2011-12 and 12-13. But clearly, India's growth rates, being higher than the world average, are increasing its share in the world economy, and what are the long-term consequences of this, seen along with other developments, strategic and so forth. So what I will really do is, this is a sort of preliminary view situated in the international relations literature, and I will be really bouncing ideas off you and dealing more in broad concepts rather than get into the detailed numbers in this talk. Now, let me just sort of tell you how I've broken it up. First, I'll talk about what, before one can come to answering or tackling the question of what kind of power India is and what kind of power will it be in the foreseeable future, next 10, 15, 20 years, one has to, conceptualize power. What is power? What constitutes power in international relations? And what are the kinds of powers? I mean, when you refer to countries, I mean, what kinds of powers are there? I mean, superpower, great power, regional power, middle power. I'll get into all these conceptualizations because I think, if we just get into projections without conceptualizing what constitutes power and how to understand power and what kinds of powers there are, one can't really situate India in the conceptualization and theorizing that is going on in the IR literature. Now, so what I'll do is first I'll talk about the typology of power, and then I'll come to the world order after the Cold War, that is the last 2 decades, and third I'll come to India's capabilities. That is, if you are getting into measuring power, I mean, what are India's characteristics or capabilities, then whether India is, what kind of power India is now, okay, and then the next section will be about the prospects in the next 15 or 20 years, assuming sort of a consistently higher than world average growth rate. Okay, you can make assumptions with different rates of growth. At this point, I don't think that's very useful. But let's assume that India grows at say 7-8%. Then what are the prospects for India? Then what of the future? Will India graduate from its present status, whatever that is? I'll come to that in a moment. To some higher status in the world order of power. Okay, and then I'll come to what are the options for India. I mean, what strategies India can follow. And then finally I'll come to 3 scenarios: a low scenario, a medium scenario, and a high scenario, and speculate on what is likely. So that's the way I've structured it, and I'll try to keep within possible injunction of 45 minutes. So coming to the typology of power, there are 2 ways broadly of measuring power. One is by measuring various indicators or ingredients of power. How many nuclear warheads, how many missiles, their range, how many combat aircraft, how many ships, submarines, size of the army, etc. Military capabilities, the economic capabilities. I mean, it's absolute GDP, share of world GDP, GDP relative to other powers, share of world GDP, share of world trade, its foreign exchange reserves, its control over vital resources like energy supplies, raw materials, and so forth, and its soft power, its intellectual, cultural power, its political acceptability as a coalition partner to other countries, and so forth. I mean, you can have different measures of power, and you can operationalize these measures in different ways and come up with some kind of an index. There have been many such exercises. I won't get into that. But broadly speaking, you're talking about measuring capabilities. The other way is to look at look at outcomes. I mean, can you get your desired outcomes? Do you get your way in the world? You can be, the United States has immeasurably greater capabilities than the state of Israel, but the state of Israel gets its way in the teeth of international opposition. Okay, so you're getting your outcomes. I mean, that means you are demonstrating power. I mean, power is not just index. One way of measuring it is to measure all these military and other economic capabilities. Other way is to look at whether these capabilities convert. And this is a huge assumption, huge leap of faith, which a lot of scholarship makes. That the assumption is that if you have these capabilities, that automatically results in power. That is, these capabilities convert into your desired outcomes, or the ability to achieve your desired outcomes, which may or may not be the case. And that depends on various factors, and that relates to India. I'll come to that later. So I think we need to get our concepts clear first. So now these capabilities, in terms of military capability, which traditional realist international relations theory, whether classical realist, neo-realist, essentially centers around military power. And military power, of course, assumes, it implies the necessary economic, industrial, technological capabilities that underlie military power, but essentially talking about military power. Now there are 2 things I think which are important to understand, which will recur in my talk later. That is what we call the offense defense balance, whether you have an offensive capability or a defensive capability. That is, you have the capability, which also relates in the nuclear era to deterrence versus compellence. Do you have the capability to deter your potential antagonists from attacking you? That means you have the capability to defend yourself. But that's not at all the same thing necessarily as the capability to compel others to do what you want. You can defend yourself. You can deter the other. Nuclear deterrence. That doesn't mean you can compel the other guy to do what you want. He can also deter you. So it's a standoff. So the distinction between deterrence and compellence is important to what kind of power you are in the world or in your region. Okay. If you look at, realists traditionally go by military power and hence implicitly by compellence. It assumes that if you have military power measured by the indicators, you have some degree of compellence and you can compel the other side or whoever it is to, well, you realize your desired outcomes. You get your outcomes because you have the power. If power assumes compellence. Now that's not necessarily so. You may be just deterrence, not compellence. Now, the other thing about power is power projection capability. Can you project power beyond your borders? And how far beyond your borders? You operate on a global scale. You can go from the United States, from North America to all the way to Afghanistan or Iraq, move a large force of over 100,000 troops, backed by Air Force, by Navy, standing off in nearby seas, and so forth. You have that power. You have the power projection capability. Or are you basically confined to your borders? You can defend yourself, but you can't project power. And you cannot change the situation elsewhere, in another country or in another part of the world. So, there again, you're getting power projection is a necessary component of compellence. Now, if you have the accumulated military power without the power projection capability, you may be just defensive. You may be in a deterrent posture, but not in a compellent posture, not necessarily able to convert your power to realize your outcomes, desired outcomes. Okay? So, just a few words about the typology of power. Now, the typology 2, which I'll deal with, is what types of powers are there in the world. And roughly speaking, the international relations theory literature, there's a vast literature on this, I won't even try to summarize it, but broadly speaking, you have superpowers, great powers. Traditionally you only had great powers. Before the advent of nuclear weapons of 1945, the use of the atom bomb, the acquisition of nuclear weapons by the 5 declared nuclear powers, which eventually, not all at one time, became also coincident with the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. They acquired nuclear capability later, Britain in 1953, France in 1960, China in 1964, and so forth. And you had just the great powers. We're theorizing about the great powers concept of Europe in the 19th century, the interwar period, you had 7 great powers. And then post-1945, you had what John Mearsheimer calls 2+3, the 2 superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union, 2 nuclear superpowers, which were so much more powerful than the rest and operated on a global scale, had a global power projection capability. And other 3 nuclear powers, that is Britain, France and China, 2 of which were allied to the US and 1 was independent, was autonomous. So, now, superpower is defined, Busan defines it as a power which has broad spectrum capabilities across the board, military, economic, technological, everything else, intellectual, cultural, and so forth, and operates globally. And then great powers, and which is also acknowledged, factored into the calculations of other states as being a global actor, including in their own regions. The way that, say, states in South Asia factor in the US as being an actor in its own region. States in East Asia also factor in. So it is also factored in a sense, implicitly or explicitly acknowledged as a superpower which operates globally. So that's the superpower. Now the great powers, there are varying definitions. The hard realists would emphasize relative military capability. Great powers are those which stand head and shoulders above the rest of the powers. You're talking about a world which has grown from 50-odd states after World War II to about 193, 194 at the moment. So almost quadrupled. So you have great powers are a handful of powers which stand head and shoulders above the rest in terms of relative military capability and its implied economic, industrial, and technological capabilities. But In another definition, in a slightly less realist, in a more sort of neoliberal, in the not economic but international relations theory sense, in the more neoliberal approach, you can be head and shoulders above in some sphere of power, like economic power. You can be a major economic power without necessarily being a major military power, but it would still be counted as a great power because you're a system-shaping power. Your magnitudes of GDP, trade growth, etc., such financial flows are such that you shape the world economy. Your movements shape the world economy. So therefore, you become a global actor in some major sphere, like the economy. And therefore, you can be counted as a great power, even if you are not a great military power. Obvious cases are Japan and Germany. So the great powers are those which are in head and shoulders above the rest of the world and very close to a superpower. Very close to, they are those who have, by all measures of power, by all indices of power, a large percentage of the power capability of the most powerful state. So if you have a significant percentage of the power capability of the most powerful state, not necessarily in every sphere, maybe just economic, maybe military, whatever, you are counted as a great power. And typically great powers in a Brownian conceptualization operate outside their region. They operate in more than their own region. If not globally, then at least over a large part of the world. So that's a great power. Now, below the great powers are say 20-30 powers are called middle powers. Now, this is a very nebulous definition. It's very difficult to define a middle power. And some of them can be regional powers, and some of them are not. Some middle powers are also regional powers, which are the dominant in their own region. Usually a fairly geographically well-defined region. But a lot of middle powers are middle because they are somewhere between the great powers and the general run of small states. But they are not necessarily regional powers. And some regional powers can be superpowers itself. In the America, North and South America, the US is the regional power dominating the entire New World. Russia used to be that, Soviet Union used to be that on the Eurasian landmass. But anyway, the middle powers might be regional powers or might not be regional powers. And then you can have a separate category, alternative kind of conceptualization called regional powers. Now, let me just first talk about regional powers. Now, a regional power can be recognized as regional power for one or both of two reasons. One is it can be dominant in the region militarily and able to exert hegemony or control or compel us in its region. Or it can be a regional leader by consent of the smaller states, its surrounding states, its neighbors. So it can be dominant by either military dominance, the classic cases of Israel, which is not accepted or even recognized diplomatically by most of its neighbors, but exercises military dominance by its undeclared nuclear capability and its high-tech conventional capability. So it is a regional power through dominance, not by consent. The opposite would be post-apartheid South Africa in southern Africa, where the southern African states consensually accept South Africa as the regional leader. So you can be a regional power either by dominance or by consent, or some mixture of the two. But you've got to have one of the two. If you are contested and you're not accepted as the regional leader, and you are not able to exert compellence. You may have all the indicators of power compared to your neighbors, but if you're not able to exercise compellence, then you're not regional power either. I'll come to this later when talking about India. Now, the middle powers, broadly speaking, there are about say 20, 25, 30 middle powers of all sizes and shapes. And you can be middle in the broader sense of being somewhere in the middle between the great powers, a handful of them, 5, 6, 7, 8, and the rest of the states out of 190 odd. But or you can be middle because you're located in the middle between two alliances, between two blocks, between two continents. You can be geographically, economically, culturally, or diplomatically in the middle. Turkey is kind of a middle power because it is middle in many senses. It is middle culturally, it is middle continentally, and so forth. In Egypt in another sense. You can be a middle power. Also, the traditional use of middle power started with Canada and Australia. You can be a power which is not a great power, but plays a middle power diplomacy role, that is a very behavioral definition. That is, you play a role of not challenging the great powers, but of steering the world system through being a mediator, a conciliator, a coalition builder, and so forth. Canada played a major role in, in pushing in the 1990s for R2P, the responsibility to protect, and for other, you can say, good citizen roles in world politics. Australia played a major role in putting together the APEC coalition, the Asia Pacific Economic Council, and also the Cairns group of agricultural exporters in the Uruguay round. So, middle power diplomacy is typically diplomacy which may not be acceptable from the great powers, which seem to have their own vested interests, but which are sort of mediatory, conciliatory roles and coalition building roles. So middle powers are 20-30 middling powers by various definitions, which are somehow in the middle, and which are not necessarily regional powers. Some of them could be. Okay. So you have four types of powers I've defined: superpower, great powers, regional powers, middle powers. These last two categories overlap. All right. And the emerging powers, the rising powers, like India is referred to often, are really a subset of the middle powers which are coming up, the upper stratum, upper echelons of the middle powers, which could be regional powers also. This is sort of the typology of power I've laid out before actually getting to India. Now, really very briefly, just what is the world order after? If you look at India as a rising power in the current post-Cold War period and in the near future, in the next 20 years, what is the post-Cold War world order? Is it unipolar? Initially, it was very unipolar in the early 90s, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, collapse of the Warsaw Pact, breakup of the Soviet Union. There was unprecedented American hegemony in the 1990s, and that gradually has eroded, despite the range of power projection demonstrated by the U.S. in Yugoslavia in the late 90s and in Afghanistan and Iraq. But still, the complexities of managing the world economy is much more multipolar than the world military order. Okay, and the complexities of managing the world economy require the superpower to elicit the cooperation of a wide range of, not just the G7, which then became G8, G7 plus Russia, but the G20, which was formed in 1999 after the Asian financial crisis, and which became activated again after the November 2008 downturn. So, the superpower now requires the cooperation to manage the world economy and restore growth and stability of a wider range of powers going outside the traditional developed Western countries in Japan. So in that sense, there's an incipient multipolarity. Some people would argue, and they did argue about a couple of years ago when talking about Chimerica, that it is an incipient bipolarity, America versus emerging China, which some people are still talking about. So one is that it's unipolar, it's a declining unipolarity, and what is going to replace this declining unipolarity? Is it going to be an incipient bipolarity or an incipient multipolarity is open to question. It's a fluid situation at the moment. Or is it already multipolar? But I would say that's going too far. The US still has unchallenged military power. Despite Russia retaining most of the Soviet arsenal, even after the 2010 treaty, when they agreed to cut to 1550 warheads each, of course that's a fudge because that's counting one bomber as one warhead. But even then, the US and Russia still are way ahead of the second rank nuclear power. So the nuclear order, is still not multipolar. Broadly speaking, the world has shifted from the interwar period. You had 7 great powers. You had no superpower. You had, say, a superpower in Pax Britannica up to the mid-19th century. Then you had no superpower with great powers. In the interwar period, you had 7 great powers. There was 0 plus 7, 0 superpowers, 7 great powers. And after the Cold War period, you had 2 plus 3. You had 2 nuclear superpowers and 3 other nuclear powers. And then post-Cold War, when the emphasis on the economy as a determinant of power and of influence has grown, and the emphasis on nuclear weapons has become less. Nuclear weapons cannot deliver you the outcomes you want. They can, in the ultimate instance, be a guarantor of security or even of threat, but they can't help you manage the world economy. So, in that sense, the world is becoming more multipolar. And say Barry Buzan was the major theorist of the regional intermediate level, which is neglected by neorealist theory. He talks about a 1+4 world. There is one superpower, the US, and four great powers, which he calls the EU, Russia, China, Japan. Already, that was 2004. Now, Japan, the question whether it's on its way down as a great power. The EU, the question about its degree of stateless. Is it a state? I mean, can you talk about it meaningfully as a coherent, as one power? So that's the world order after the Cold War. Now, let me just, having laid out all this about the psychology of power and types of power and the polarity, the types of what kind of polarity the world has now, let me just jump to India's characteristics. Now, India is a nuclear power with a small nuclear arsenal in which the claimed thermonuclear capability is a questioned one. It is being questioned by Dr. Santhanam and by various others, whether the thermonuclear test was a fizzle or not. But it has a small nuclear arsenal estimated from 100 to 150 warheads with a limited missile reach, even with the Agni 5 test last year. It could deter China, but it has no strike capability on any of the other nuclear powers. Therefore, it is in principle vulnerable to a first strike capability by at least four of the nuclear weapon powers, and perhaps even by China. Its naval reach is still essentially a brown water navy, despite operations against minor threats like pirates or nuclear or marine terrorism. Otherwise, against a great power navy, it is still not a blue water navy, a brown water navy. Its aerial reach is limited, so in that military sense, it is a constrained power, definitely limited power, despite having a nuclear capability. Now, its economic characteristics is where it has the potential for rising up the power ladder in the world. And if you look at it briefly speaking, it's 2.6% of world GDP. Most of these figures I'm giving are the latest figures. 2011 figures are available. 2010, like 2011 is not available. I won't get into too much detail here, but approximately say 2.6% of world GDP and 2% of world manufacturing value added. Comparison for China is 9% of world GDP, 18% of manufacturing value added. So it's order of magnitude difference. Okay, if you look at against the superpower, the US, I mean China's GDP is now about like 45% of the US GDP. I mean, I'm not talking GDP terms, I'm talking at current prices. And India is just about something like an eighth, or approximately. It's about 1.67% of world merchandise exports. China is more than 10%. 2% of world trade. 3.3% of world services exports. China is more than that. Despite services exports, I mean, despite the IT success in India's case, China's services exports are 4.5%. Its trade GDP ratio is about 43%. It has become much more globalized in terms of trade GDP ratio. And its fiscal deficit is about 9% of GDP. China's is about 2.3%. The debt GDP ratio is about 64%. China's is about 34%, much less. Foreign exchange reserves have been in the last 2-3 years about 6, 7, 8 in the world roughly. It's been large, about $300 billion plus minus 20, 30 billion. China's is like $2.8 trillion. It's the world's biggest, overwhelmingly. Japan's is about $1 trillion. So we're talking about this is comparing it with the other major rising power, China. I mean, it's already accepted as a great power. It's not a superpower. Where India is strong is the savings rate, the investment rate are in their 30s, like 33-35%, which is jumped by from 23-24%, it's gone to about mid-30s, which gives the basic ingredient. I mean the capacity for sustained high growth. Okay, its share of IMF quotas has just recently been increased, which means some degree of international recognition of its economy, but it's still the poorest economy in the G20 in per capita terms. So that's the broad economic profile. In terms of population, 17% of world population, China is 19%, but that 17% is crammed into an area 1/3 of China. It's a very high density. It can become water. Food security is relatively good as of now, but it can become water stressed. It is overwhelmingly dependent on imported oil. 80% of oil is imported. 25% of total energy use is imported. And it has no major natural resources other than coal and iron ore. It is not among the top 3 producers of the 16 major industrial minerals. So it is geographically, in terms of natural resource, in terms of land, water, and natural resources and energy, highly cramped, highly constrained. It does not have the kind of space in the flexibility in these areas, which are also an ingredient of power potential in the long run. So that's the broad economic profile. And so if you look at this profile in the background of what I said earlier about the typology of power, what kind of power is India now? Is it, first of all, let me ask the question, is it a regional power or is it a middle power? Now, by the definition of regional power, it does not have the capacity to exert compellence in the region, because Pakistan has a nuclear deterrent capability and can and has been until just yesterday able to carry out attacks within India by using non-state actors without India being able to meaningfully do anything except suffer. So it is not able to dominate the region in the sense of it has a deterrent capability, but it doesn't have a compellent capability, and therefore it does not dominate the region. And its dominance is contested even by the smaller states. Until recently, until this government, by Bangladesh, by Sri Lanka, even by Nepal, even recently by Maldives, Indian hegemony is not accepted, or dominance not accepted, contested or resisted by the smaller states. So it does not have regional, by the definition of regional power, either being able to dominate and compel, or being able to generate consensus that be accepted as a leader. Neither of these criteria is India's regional power. It is a regional actor, but not a regional power by either of these criteria, or a mix of the two. Now, so that would leave it more as a middle power, something in the 2030 powers, like it's in the G20, among the upper levels of the middle powers as of now, and also by middle power diplomacy. India is an attractive partner for a whole range of countries for all kinds of things on economic in the G20 and in all kinds of free trade agreements that India is now striking with various Southeast Asian countries, with ASEAN, with countries to its West, countries which has increasing cooperation, aid to Africa. It has a range of diversified relationships, like its trade basket is diversified. It is a country against which nobody has anything in particular. I mean, apart from Pakistan or China, it is an attractive coalition partner in a range of issue areas, in economy, in climate change, and all kinds of areas. So that way, it plays a middle power diplomacy role of being a coalition builder. Even in military sense, India has in the last 15-20 years, especially in the last 10 years, had increasing range of naval exercises and military exercises, especially naval exercises, with a whole range of Indian Ocean rim countries, especially Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the US and Japan, Australia, and so forth. So it is behaving more like a middle power coalition building sort of pattern of diplomacy in the economic and regional, extra-regional, larger Asian or Asia-Pacific regional areas. So it is acting in its own region. It's not accepted, it's contested or resisted. But it is outside the region, it still has gaining influence through economic and other diplomacy. So it is in that kind of situation. Now, it cannot, its constraints are, it cannot dominate Pakistan or China due to nuclear deterrence and their conventional capability. Though it can deter them. So it is limited to a deterrence, that is defensive posture, but doesn't have a compellent capability to realize its desired outcomes in those countries or with regard to territory or border. It cannot even exercise compellence on the smaller states. As I just said, even Maldives is now able to tell India where to get off. So and it doesn't have the power projection capability to project power across the ocean, because except for Sri Lanka and Maldives, there's a vast stretch of Indian Ocean all the way west, east and south. So if you look at India in the Nielsheimer's terms, that geography is important. Geography is important and geostrategic is important, in the sense that geography is your land area, population density, your availability of arable land, water, natural resources, minerals, energy. You don't have all that. I mean, all that is huge population crammed into, relative to population, a small area, lack of energy, natural resources, food security so far, but can be water stressed, all of that. So geographical constraints are there. Then you have geostrategic constraints, which means what kind of neighbors you have, what kind of capabilities they have. The entire north, the Pakistan and Chinese Himalayan border, you have two nuclear neighbors which have the capability to deter you in nuclear terms. And the entire south, you can't project far southward. There's a vast stretch of ocean. So therefore, India is geostrategically boxed in. It is constrained. So even if the economy grows, and you can project any kind of growth rate you like, those constraints, the geographical and geostrategic constraints of being boxed in, will remain. So in that sense, the argument is that India is a constrained power. Now, just to elaborate on this a bit, to go from, you can conceptualize power also in a different way. One is that weight, influence and power. Now, if you look at your weight in the world, that is your share of world GDP, share of world trade, etc., India's weight, if it grows at a faster rate than the world economy, its share will increase. That is, its weight in the world will increase. Now, along with weight increasing, influence will increase. It will become a more attractive market. It can become, like John Dunning wrote a long time back, or 30 years ago, that it can emerge as a strategic market. And a strategic market in the management literature is that a market which cannot be ignored by any of the major companies in the world. So you may have the Fortune 500 companies. Nobody can ignore the Indian market, because the Indian market becomes a significant share of the world market for larger and larger types of products. Perhaps even luxury products, although there's only a tiny sliver of India which can afford that, but the numbers are large. So it can become a strategic market in more and more products, which then becomes a magnet for the large companies all over the world. So that will give it influence and also coalitional capabilities. And it will also, in that sense, its weight can increase, its influence can increase, but whether weight and influence will translate into power, which in a realist sense to be meaningful would mean the ability to project power or to exercise compellence to achieve your desired outcome. That may not happen. I mean, the conversion from weight to power through influence might not happen, because that's a big jump. There are two jumps. So now, what are the prospects like? If you go from today to say next 20 years, you assume you can make all kinds of assumptions. The economists make all kinds of assumptions of project say 8% growth, 10% growth. Now, like with the BRICS, the BRICS has increased their share of world GDP from 17% to 26%, and the BRICS means mainly heavily China. But the BRICS is not, it's a geopolitical category possibly, in the sense that they can be in various political coalitions on economic issues, they can act as a bloc, but they're not geostrategic, they are geographically all over the place. They're not geostrategic. So you can make all kinds of projections and say that, okay, if India's share of the world GDP becomes so much, X, Y, whatever, then you will have greater weight, and therefore you make a sort of mental jump that you will have power. But that's not necessarily so, which for reasons I've explained, that greater weight means greater influence, but that doesn't necessarily translate into compellence. Even if India's missile reach and naval reach get extended, which they will, that still doesn't give necessarily a power projection capability in the Indian Ocean, which has many other major powers, including the superpowers, as actors. So it can give you a greater coalitional bargaining power in the sense that you have more to bring to the table in negotiations, to offer. But it doesn't necessarily give you the power to exert compellence even within your own region. So, what are the, if say India grows at even a sustained 7-8% growth rate, you have a savings GDP, investment GDP ratio of somewhere in the mid-30s, you translate into, you have an incremental capital output ratio of say 4.0 or whatever, so you can get 8% growth. Even then, you may not be able to convert that into meaningful power. You can still be constrained. Now, let me give two examples of, economists tend to make these long-term linear projections, although there will be inevitable discontinuities because there will be all kinds of events, political, economic, technological, which will create discontinuities and will upset those long-term projections. But the assumption made is that the conversion is a smooth one, a seamless one, between greater weight, economic weight, and power. Now, there are obvious counter-examples. I mean, Russia is a counter-example, as a declining power from the Soviet Union days to now. It is still the world number 2 military power with the capability to destroy the US, even against a first strike. But it has very little compellent power even outside its region, even within Georgia, which is part of the former Soviet Union, contested. The US has acquired bases in Kyrgyzstan and in Uzbekistan in the post-Afghanistan scenario. So Russia has not been able to prevent that. Those are outcomes which are not desired outcomes for Russia. It has not been able to prevent most of Eastern Europe joining NATO, and many of them joining the EU. So Russia has an enormous nuclear arsenal, which still forces the US to negotiate a treaty with it. But it doesn't have the conversion capability to convert that nuclear arsenal into any kind of meaningful desired outcome, or even to prevent undesirable outcomes on its fringes. So that conversion is something which cannot be assumed by just measuring power by the indicators of power. The other example is Japan, where you have enormous economic power, which in the entire Cold War period did not convert into meaningful political or military power. I mean, it has a sophisticated conventional military, including naval, etc. But because of geostrategics, what Miyazama talks about, it has surrounded by powerful nuclear neighbors. It has the backing of the US. But Russia, the Far Eastern Fleet, is a nuclear fleet. China is a nuclear power. And so it cannot dominate its region. It cannot have the desired outcomes in its region. So it has enormous global economic power without being regional power. And it is not able to convert economic power into political outcomes or even prevent undesirable political outcomes necessarily. So you have, I'm giving you 2 examples of how massive nuclear arsenal in the case of Russia doesn't convert into compellence, even in its region, or into desired outcomes. And even into being able to prevent undesirable outcomes. And you have massive economic power in the case of Japan, which in the most of the Cold War and post-Cold War period has not been convertible into meaningful political power. So this huge assumption that long-term projections of growth rates made by economists doesn't work, because you're assuming a conversion which may not happen, because there are geographical and geostrategic factors which constrain countries. And India, I argue, is one of those countries to which this conversion problem applies. India is, I would say, the conversion problem applies because it is blocked by the fact of 2 nuclear neighbors with contested borders and contested territorial claims. So that also does have second-order effect. Second-order effect is you have to have a huge army. 50% of the Ministry of Defense budget as of last year goes on the army, not Air Force or Navy. Air Force or Navy are the forces of the future, forces of power projection of the future. But you have a huge, low-tech, labor-intensive, basically peasant army, which has to be maintained because we have these contested borders with nuclear neighbors. So that ties down, blocks resources. It, in fact, prevents the growth of the kind of force capabilities of the future, of the power projection capabilities. So it is geostrategically blocked to the north. To the south, there is the ocean. And it needs a huge jump, what John Miyazama calls the stopping power of water, historically, in long-term historical terms. Large bodies of water are difficult to jump across, except for the technologically and economically most advanced powers. So there again, power projection is for India. And given the fact that in that body of water, the Indian Ocean and Western Pacific, there are other major nuclear powers present, naval powers present. So India is therefore geostrategically constrained, which will not be overcome even if you project a 7-8% growth for 20 years. These constraints are still going to be there. So India may acquire greater weight in the world, but not and greater influence, because it will have more to bring to the table. But it will not acquire a compellent power. It will still be a basically defensive country in a deterrent mode, defensive mode. That's my basic argument. I mean, then what are the options? I mean, one is about the region. Since you can't compel the region, and that may not even be the best way of trying to be a regional power, ideally you should try to get the consent of the region, get the acceptance of your neighbors. Now, you can do that. I mean, in the higher theory literature, there's a huge literature on bandwagoning versus balancing. Why do, in the last 300 years, when a polar power emerges, or an emerging power comes up, rises, there are 2 kinds of behaviors that countries around it can indulge in, can undertake. One is to balance against it, in the sense of counterbalance, coalesce against it, prevent it. Other is to bandwagon, to join the bandwagon of the rising power. Now, historically speaking, India's neighbors have tried to balance rather than bandwagon with it. Why? Because if it was a closed economy with 300% peak tariffs, 100% average tariffs, you have no point living next to a large market. It's a closed market. I mean, why would the Bangladeshis, etc., why? They couldn't access it. Why would the Sri Lankans? They would look elsewhere to the world market. Now, if India becomes, as it is increasingly, lowering tariffs and becoming an increasingly liberalized market, the Indian market can be a lure and it can be, preferential treatment for the neighbors, the SAARC neighbors, can be one in which can induce bandwagoning, give them incentives to bandwagon with India, and then develop within their domestic politics the groups which have a stake, become stakeholders in India, in close relations with India. So India can, through economic policy, potentially induce bandwagoning and therefore become a regional power by consent, not by trying to compel, That's one possible, in fact the only possible option, which is why I think the present government is, despite 2611, etc., going ahead with trying to increase trade relations with Pakistan, because there's no other option. I mean, similarly with the smaller countries. So now, one moment. I would say that I would conclude by saying there are three possible scenarios. I mean, a low, medium, and high. The low scenario would be slow to medium growth. I mean, if the growth rate slumps to below 6%, 5%, that you need at least that much to create jobs for a largely young population, which large numbers are joining the labor force. You need a much higher growth rate than the developed countries to create jobs to absorb the huge numbers of young people coming onto the labor market. Okay, so slow medium growth scenario, that means there will be no bandwagoning. I mean, you will have less incentive. You can offer less incentive to your neighbors, and there will be limited extra regional influence. The medium scenario is one of rapid growth, say 7, 8, 9%. And still no bandwagoning, because the conflicts with the neighbors, especially Pakistan, is something which maybe economic incentives cannot overcome. Maybe you will be frozen in a sort of deterrent mode, but India will get extra regional influence as a coalition partner in a whole range of other arenas around the world. In a sense, it will be like China, in the sense that China is contested in its region. I mean, it has conflict with Japan, with Taiwan, with Vietnam, with South China Sea, East China Sea, all around. But it is an enormous global power, despite being contested within its region. So India could also, that's one possibility, the second scenario. The third scenario is when there is high growth, bandwagoning. I mean, India creates a sort of consensus around itself, becomes a regional leader through consensus and through incentives, and acquires extra regional influence in a whole range of other spheres outside its region and in various other issue arenas, and becomes a coalition partner on a range of. So that would be the high scenario. So these are three scenarios. And I think the kind of middling scenario would be more likely one. That is, bandwagoning is not enough to dissolve the Indo-Pakistan antagonism. It will remain. But India will acquire through greater weight, greater influence outside the region without necessarily becoming a regional leader, accepted regional leader. They are being resisted within its region, but still acquire a broader, through economic weight, broader influence. So I think that would be, I mean, it's all speculation, but I'm saying if in these three kinds of scenarios, which I'm projecting, I would say the middle scenario is the most likely one. So I'll call it, I'll bring it to a close. Thank you.
Sridharan, you have done a great job, I would say. In 45 minutes time, starting from the theoretical framework to contextualizing India, and then with empirical evidences you try to make a point which is very convincing to many of us. But there may be people who are still not convinced. I would reserve my comment for the end. In the meantime, the floor is open. Yeah, please, sir. Start. Try to be brief because you can see the crowd.
My name is Sanjay.